Well, I started in the civil court in 1973, and that was the real advent of the housing court. Uh, I was a civil court judge in Bronx County at that time, and we had 5 judges assigned to Bronx County, and it was something brand new, and they became housing court judges. Uh, in the prior times, the landlord-tenant cases were handled by civil court judges, and the 5 housing court judges that were assigned eventually during the year of 73 were not really enough to take up the volume. So it was really the civil court judges and the new housing court judges that took care of landlord-tenant disputes.
So you were a sitting civil court judge at the time that the housing part was created.
That's correct.
And as a civil court judge, you presided over landlord-tenant disputes.
That is correct.
So at the time that the court was created, it's my understanding that there were some things prior to its creation that were heard in criminal court. What we came to know as HP cases, the code violation cases, had previously been criminal court cases, right?
They were handled in the criminal court where they never should have been, but they were handled there, and once we started the housing parts, they were taken out of the criminal parts and put into the housing court.
And were each of the 5 housing court judges and the civil court judges that presided in the landlord-tenant part doing HP cases, or right from the beginning was there a separate HP part?
There was no separate part at that point. Don't forget, we only had about 10 judges when we started.
Mm-hmm.
There were 5 in the Bronx and I think 5 in Manhattan. We were practically experimental. I don't even think there were any judges at that time, if my memory is right, in Brooklyn or Queens or Staten Island. It was just 5 in the Bronx, 5 in Manhattan.
Do you remember at the time that the court was created, was it welcomed by the court system? Was it welcomed by the practitioners, or was everybody a little suspicious of what is this thing called housing court?
Well, I can say it was welcomed by the civil court judges because they took up the tremendous volume of landlord-tenant cases, and this was an aid. Not only an aid, it took most of the problems that the civil court judges had and gave it to a new breed of judges called the housing court judges, who are ostensibly experienced in landlord-tenant disputes and landlord-tenant law.
So even even from the beginning, the civil court judges were happy to turn over the load to the housing court judges?
Well, they never gave the load away because there were always civil court judges, especially in the beginning. There were always civil court judges that were necessary because the housing court judges could not handle the tremendous volume that you had in the landlord-tenant parts.
And we were talking a little bit before we started about the legislation being passed in 72 for the creation of the court, but it didn't open until 73. Can you tell us a little bit about why the delay?
Well, the legislation was passed, and as happens a great many times up in Albany, legislation is passed, but funding is not given.
Mm-hmm.
So one without the other is meaningless. And we went back to the legislature, we couldn't get it, and the administrative judge at that time was a former fire commissioner, Edward Thompson, who had to sue almost everyone, the legislature, the governor, etc., to attempt to get funding so we can start a housing part. The lawsuit turned out to be very successful, and eventually we got the funding, and we were able to start the housing part in 1973.
And at that point, you said you were a civil court judge, but you became the administrative judge judge in the civil court at some point. When was that?
I became the chief administrative judge in 1982.
So by that time, about 10 years of the court already in existence. Was there an increase in the number of judges by then? Was the housing court more accepted by that point once you became in charge?
It became accepted to a certain degree, but there were still problems. The housing court was taking in about 350,000, if my memory is correct, housing disputes. These were cases that were actually filed in the court system. It couldn't be handled with 10 judges because when I came in, there was still only 10 judges. Some of them were spread around where Brooklyn started to have some, one or two, Queens, etc. So the first thing I realized, we have to have much more judges and a lot of other things if we were to make the housing court a proper court for landlord-tenant disputes.
And so today we have 50 housing court judges. I know in 1999 we added the last 10 slots to get us up to 50. Do you recall when it went from 10 to, I think there was 30 for a while, right?
I brought in, within the first month or two of my administration, I brought in 20 new housing judges. I received authorization and the funding for 20 new judges, and it became a real court. We were able to put judges in every county.
And the process of getting approval for 20 additional judges, the politics, the funding, do you remember was there a struggle? Was it a fight?
There's always a fight to get funding, whether you talk about today's times or times when I became the administrative judge. There was always problems with funding, and the housing court was a court where everybody realized there was a court, but the money was never there. We had to practically go and beg for the money. I had worked in Albany as counsel. In fact, I became deputy counsel to the House minority at that point. I knew my way around, and talking to legislators up there, etc., and people down here, I was able to get the funding to have the 20 new judges.
Today, if you walk into any resolution part, you'll see a judge, you'll see a clerk, you'll see a court attorney, and an officer, and an interpreter. What was the staffing like? Do you recall in its initial days?
When I started, there was absolutely no staffing at all. There was a court officer that became a clerk and the court officer and everything else in between.
So even to get funding for the staffing that we have today was a struggle?
It was a struggle, yeah.
And do you think the funding issue is the biggest challenge that the court faced during your tenure, or are there other challenges that you would say were equally hard to overcome?
Well, the funding was a problem. The way the housing court facilities were stationed at was a problem. In the Bronx, it was a horror. They were in the basement in small cubby holes, I would call it. In the other counties, it wasn't much better, although it was a little better in Manhattan. But that was a problem. The problem also was taking care of the parts itself. With only a court officer stationed in the part, it couldn't operate very well. You needed a clerk, etc., and that was one of the other things I was able to accomplish. I finally got authorization to hire clerks for each of the parts. I got authorization finally to have law assistants assigned to the judges in the parts. It began to look like a real court.
And can you tell us a little bit about the struggle for that? Was it, I think those of us who've been around for a while would say that the housing court was the stepchild of the court system, and it it wasn't a real court, quote unquote. And was that part of why there was a reluctance to give, for instance, law assistance?
Well, the reluctance was there again because basically funding, and the housing court was not a constitutional court. It was a court established by the legislature as part of the civil court, and the funding had to be divided between the civil court and the housing parts, and that became the big struggle.
You were in charge of both, right? The civil
Yes.
court and the housing court.
Yes.
Housing court being part of the civil court. So, were you often called upon to take those limited resources and put them more in the civil court do you think because it wasn't a constitutional court?
No, I was able to carefully make sure that the housing court, in my opinion, was adequately funded.
So, did the volume stay pretty steady at about 350,000 filings during your tenure?
It varied between 350,000 and about 450,000,
Oh my God.
maybe even more at times.
Wow. So let's talk a little bit about code enforcement because there are many people who say that the court was created to focus attention on the need to maintain and protect the housing stock. So can you tell us how you think that, assuming that purpose as the purpose of the court, how has the court fulfilled that purpose?
Well, that was one of the purposes of the legislation to obtain a housing part, was to take care at least of the present housing stock, which was basically largely in deplorable conditions throughout the city. And there were problems. There were money problems as far as tenants were concerned. There were a lot of problems. We were dealing with people who had their own financial problems. We were dealing with owners who didn't want to take care of their buildings, who at times let their buildings go down, took all the rents, and then just disappeared. And we had abandoned buildings or buildings that the city eventually had to take over. There were a lot of problems going on. It was monumental.
Did you, was HPD in the courtroom from the beginning? We do have one part now that is actually part-time, to my knowledge, in each borough that does have HPD lawyers who are here on a regular basis. Was that the case right from the start?
When we started, the HPD lawyers were just part of the regular calendar parts, trial parts that we had, and they were assigned when needed.
So,
I should also add, when I took over, you now have computers in the court. You had nothing like computers at that point. I think I was the first one that brought computers into the courtrooms, which were ultimately adopted by the other parts of the civil court, Supreme Court, etc.
did the housing court have them first?
They were one of the first. I realized that we're coming to a new age, and we just couldn't sit back. Well, I came in during the 1900s. We were probably in another century as far as the courts were concerned. I realized something had to be done, and there was a computer show at the old Coliseum up around Columbus Circle. So I and some of the members of the court went with me, and we went to that computer show, and I saw some of the computers that I thought could be great for the housing parts. I was able to convince the administration that at least we should experiment and bring some of these computers into the court, which we did. They realized that not only the housing parts, all the court system had to be modernized as far as us entering the computer age. And I brought the computers in. We worked out a system where we went into HPD, the Housing Preservation Development area. We were able to go directly in there with a way of working it out. The housing judges were able to see within a few minutes the violations that were on a piece of property and a lot of other things, and it eventually developed into something that is being used to this very day.
Oh, absolutely, and I can't imagine not having access to the computer screen for the violations. Was it immediately welcomed by the litigants, by the lawyers?
Well, it was welcomed by everyone. Before the computer age, the attorneys from HPD had to go back to their offices to obtain lists of housing violations, etc., with respect to a particular case. The judges were tearing their hair out as far as finding out the violations and how the time it took to obtain a list of a violation on a particular building. It was a very frustrating area as far as that was concerned. But we had that solved.
I think we need you back, Judge Rubin, because we've been trying to get easy access to DHCR information for about 10 years now.
Well, the problem with DHCR, there's a lot of confidential information in there, and that's one of the things that had to be solved. Before I left the court, I tried to resolve it. I guess my successors were not able to resolve it, but the main problem we had was, according to DHCR at least, was some confidential information that they had. We also try to get into social services because many of the problems, as you know, are social service problems in addition to the housing problems per se. And again, that was almost impossible, and I can't say I disagreed with them because most of the reports in social services are very confidential, and they couldn't be released.
So do you think, given how prescient you were with getting computers into the court initially, do you think you can envision a courtroom for the near future that would better serve the needs of the litigants and lawyers in the housing court? What would make for the perfect housing courtroom of the 21st century?
Well, first of all, facilities, probably computers brought up to date. There's a lot of things that could be done. In my opinion, the housing court should be a constitutional court and take its place with all the other courts, so you wouldn't have the problem of people thinking that the housing court is not a real court. And that was one of the problems that we faced, and I think it's being faced to this very day. If we had a constitutional court, everyone knows that you have a real court taking its place as part of the judicial system in the state of New York.
I very much would like to support that. So over your tenure here, I'm guessing you were involved in appointing some of the housing court judges. Do you have any idea how many appointments you were involved with?
Well, the 20 appointments were mine that I brought in at the time we were able to get the funding for new housing judges. So I brought in those 20 and probably brought in a few more after that. I don't recall how many at this point.
I wonder if you remember at all the applicant pool for housing court judges now. I think you would be surprised to know that there are less than 40 applications now for what are surely 2 openings on the court. Do you remember, because I do, that there were hundreds of applicants
There weren't, I don't know if there were hundreds, but there were a heck of a lot more than 40 for two positions.
So I wonder if you have any thoughts about why. What is that a function of salary? Judicial salaries are, as we all know, not in keeping with private salaries, or do you think that's the constitutionality of the court? I just wonder if you have any thoughts about why we are having trouble getting people.
Well, I think it's a little of everything. First of all, it's not that easy to become a housing court judge, and applicants realize it. They have to have the experience, the temperament. They go before the advisory council, and the advisory council is not the easiest council for an applicant to get through. And then you come to the administrative judge, and as I understand it, the way it works now, not only the administrative judge, it goes to the citywide judge. So there's a larger element that is in play right now as far as becoming a housing court judge.
We still have good applicants. I don't want to say not. We don't seem to have quite as many as I remember from the past. So, can you maybe tell us, are there sort of favorite memories that you have of your time and involvement in the court? What were some of its greatest achievements, or possibly some of its biggest failures, if any?
Well, I think one of the greatest achievements was bringing the court into a system that was at least looked like a regular constitutional court. The fact that I was able to get clerks into the court, law assistants came into the court, it became something that everyone would envision a court to be like. If they went into the regular parts of the civil court, they went into the Supreme Court, this is what they would see. They would see judges, they would see clerks, they would see law assistants. I think we now call them court attorneys, but they were law assistants. We saw the elements of a real functioning court. I think that was part of my greatest achievement. I should also add that one of the things that helped me is that because some of my friends in the communication business helped me get on certain news programs where I decried the fact of the underfunding of the court, the housing court in particular, and the problems that the court went through. And it was received very, very nicely. In fact, there was an editorial in the New York Times praising some of my achievements in the housing court.
We need to get a copy of that.
I have no idea where it is. Maybe they can get it out of the archives of the Times.
Do you remember when, approximately?
In that time that I was there, I don't remember exactly when.
And did you tell me you did something with Ralph Penza?
Yeah, well, that was one of the news programs that I was on.
What was that about?
He came up to the Bronx to view the housing court because one of the attorneys, whether it was the Legal Services or one of the other organizations, told him how horrible it was where the lines were so big, waiting to even see a clerk, so that tenants came in with their petitions, etc. They had to come in, but they couldn't afford to hire attorneys, and the lines went all around the clerk's office, out into the hallway at times, etc. And he was there because of these complaints and interviewed me, and it turned out to be a very, very successful interview, because one of the last remarks he made after the interview was, based on what he saw and based on the interview with me, there was no question that more money had to be poured into the housing court.
And was it?
Eventually, we did.
So
These are
did-
little gimmicks you had to know and do as far as getting funding was concerned.
Was there a struggle at that point, even after this good press, or
There's-
was the legislature fairly forthcoming?
There's always a struggle, whether it's the housing court or the regular court system. Uh, there was always a struggle getting funding, and it probably is to this very day.
Do you remember I'm just going back to the 20 appointments for a minute. Where were the applicants from? What kinds of people came when their 20 positions opened up?
According to the court rules, or the Office of Court Administration, etc., positions had to be advertised in a way. We had to open it up for certain papers that printed positions. Certain ways the Office of Court Administration made us at that point advertise. They were on court lists going around the city, especially letting applicants know that there were positions available and telling them how to apply, etc.
I think our longest serving housing court judge, Jerry Klein, was appointed by you,
That was
right?
my appointment,
Yeah.
yes.
He's proudly got his license plate, Housing Court Judge 1. Yes.
And I understand he's up in Bronx County right now.
He is in your old territory, exactly. Did you sit at all as a civil court judge, not administrative supervisor, but as a civil court judge in any other county, you yourself?
Not as a housing judge. The way things worked out, I was a civil court judge, started in January of '73. I handled we had counterparts in those days, and I handled the calendar in Bronx County for the landlord-tenant parts, etc. I was there for about 6 months in the civil court, and I was then appointed as an acting Supreme Court judge. But I did both. I did my civil court work in the morning, Supreme Court work in the afternoon. And those days we didn't get paid extra for being an acting Supreme Court judge. It was considered a promotion, etc. Not a monetary promotion, but it was considered somewhat of a promotion within the court system. But I did both. I handled trials in the afternoon, Supreme Court trials, and did my part of my regular duty during the daytime.
I ask about the other boroughs because one of the things that we talk about, the housing court judges, is that the different boroughs seem to have different, well, people say Manhattan gets better treatment, that the facilities are better, the access to computers is better, and I wonder if that's always been a problem or a perception, if you dealt with any of those issues, either yourself or as the supervising judge.
I think it's the perception of the entire court system that the main focus is in Manhattan, whether it be the housing court, the Supreme Court, family court, etc.
But I assume having been in charge, you would like to dispel people of that
Oh
notion.
yeah, I used to travel all around, Staten Island included.
So as we think about 40 years of the court and we look to the next 40 years of the court, making it a constitutional court, better funding, more judges, or you think we've reached kind of a good balance at this point?
Well, you have 50 judges right now, and you probably reached the balance. You can always use more judges. There's no question of that. I understand the volume is still great. tenants, attorneys, landlords have to wait to get into a part. We no longer have a counterpart. Cases are signed as they are in most courts at this point, to a to a particular judge. There's still problems in that degree. The volume is greater than any other part of the court system. That's something that has to be resolved. I think perhaps we need a greater mediation system, and maybe even take some of the cases where we have attorneys on both sides into maybe compulsory arbitration, so that we take away some of the volume of the housing judges. There are things that have been done. There are things that I know will be done in the future. You have an excellent administrative judge right now, Fern Fisher. I thought I was going to be the longest running administrative judge of the civil court, but Judge Fisher has far exceeded the years that I put in, and I know her love for the court. She is also the citywide administrator, but the housing court to her is her baby.
Yeah.
And she loves this court, and she's putting everything she can into the court.
Now, I thought you were here for longer than she's been here, but you're telling me now.
No,
How many years were you?
I was
in
here
charge?
between 82 and 89.
Oh, okay. I thought it was 10, 15 years.
In 89, the governor appointed me to the appellate division.
So you left us for the major leagues.
Yeah. Well, I left you, and I didn't entirely leave the Supreme Court because there were problems even in the Supreme Court in Manhattan. They were behind in decisions on motions. Some of the judges were tremendously backed up, and they asked me to take a load. I probably took over 100 motions and handle those motions in what they call my spare time. And I also became, during that time, the acting surrogate at Kings County because
You had a full plate.
yeah, because the surrogate at that time would disqualify himself, would recuse himself on some political situations that occurred in Kings County, and they asked me to take it over. I brought the lawyers and litigants into Manhattan, into my office in this building at 111 Center, and I became the acting surrogate at Kings County for those cases.
One huge problem we face today, and I wonder over the last 40 years if it's been a recurring problem, is a chronic shortage of interpreters. How has that always been a problem, and how has it been addressed over the last 40 years, do you think?
Well, it's always been a problem. First of all, there were very few interpreters when I took over. In fact, we basically had to call certain services that would supply interpreters to us. In Brooklyn, we had a big problem because many of the tenants, in particular in Brooklyn, came from Haiti, and they were French-speaking, Creole-speaking, and the court didn't have any interpreters for that particular language. We had to bring them in. We brought interpreters into the court so that, again, the judges wouldn't be stonewalled waiting for an interpreter to suddenly come in. There was never enough, even when I left. You have a great Hispanic population right now, and Hispanic interpreters in particular were needed, and you probably even need more at this point to really take care of all the parts. But they were problems, and again, that had a lot to do with funding.
Some things never change.
No.
So the courtroom, the housing court of the future, as somebody who brought computers into it, in the interpreting issue, do you think we should think about how computers might help? Is there a distance interpreting service that maybe you could Skype or some equivalent that you think would be a good way to move in the future?
Oh, I think there are probably ways to move in the future. Look, when I was a kid, we used to look at a series of Buck Rogers, and we never envisioned that we would go to space. Now we go to space. The computers are more sophisticated than they ever were, and I'm sure that our computer system, particularly in the housing pods, can be brought up to the 21st century, and a lot probably can still be done. But again, funding is a problem. Money doesn't solve all the problems. It solves some of the problems. Uh, and one of the big problems we have, look, there are landlord-tenant problems. The housing stock has not really improved that much in the city of New York. Landlord-tenant relationships were always a problem. When I used to speak, I used to consider the landlord-tenant problems probably the second most passionate relationship that we know of. And it's probably true to this very day.
What's the first?
Marriage.